Tonight, something extraordinary happened in Washington, and it didn't happen with a bang or a bombshell tweet. It happened with a refusal. Former President Donald Trump said no to Congress, no to oversight, no to answering questions that the Constitution says he must answer. And that single word, no, lit a fuse under Capitol Hill. What makes this moment so volatile is that it goes far beyond a single refusal or a single figure. At its core, Congress is facing a direct and unusually blunt challenge to its constitutional authority, and that is something the institution is structurally designed not to ignore. From the very beginning of the American system, Congress was given investigative power not as a courtesy from the executive branch, but as a necessary tool to check it. When that power is openly rejected, the issue is no longer political disagreement. It becomes a question of whether the system itself still functions as intended. The hook here is that this confrontation did not emerge from chaos or crisis. It came from routine oversight. Congress asked for compliance with lawful requests, the same mechanism used for decades to examine war decisions, financial scandals, and executive misconduct. Trump's refusal was not narrowly tailored or legally cautious. It was sweeping. And that is precisely why it landed like a shockwave on Capitol Hill. A flat refusal signals something very different from negotiation. It signals that one branch is attempting to redefine the limits of another. What makes this especially combustible is the precedent it threatens to establish. Congressional oversight only works if it is enforced. The moment a former president can simply opt out without immediate consequence, the authority of Congress becomes conditional rather than constitutional. Lawmakers understand this instinctively. If this refusal stands, future presidents will not see subpoenas as obligations but as suggestions. That quiet shift would permanently weaken the legislative branch, regardless of which party controls it. There is also a deeper institutional anxiety at play. Congress has, over the years, allowed much of its power to erode through inaction, delay, and political caution. This moment forces a reckoning. Either Congress reasserts itself now, or it tacitly accepts a reduced role in the balance of power. That is why reactions escalated so quickly behind the scenes. This is not about scoring points on television. This is about survival as a co-equal branch of government. Another hook in this confrontation is that it strips away the usual defenses. Executive privilege, when invoked properly, is debated, narrowed, and litigated. What happened here bypassed that entire process. By refusing outright, Trump effectively dared Congress to prove it still has teeth. That dare transforms oversight from a bureaucratic process into a high-stakes institutional test. The danger for Congress is not just embarrassment or delay, it is irrelevance. If lawmakers hesitate, if they soften their response out of political fear, they risk teaching the next executive exactly how to evade scrutiny. That lesson would outlast any single administration. And lawmakers know that once authority is surrendered, it is rarely regained. This is why legal enforcement is no longer theoretical. Courts, contempt powers, and statutory penalties suddenly move from the margins to the center of the conversation. Congress is being pushed into a corner where action is not just an option, but a necessity. The refusal itself has narrowed their choices. What makes this moment so compelling and so dangerous is that it reveals how fragile oversight can be when it is tested directly. The Constitution assumes conflict between branches, but it also assumes resistance. When one branch says no, the system only holds if the other insists on an answer. What gives this moment its real weight is that it cannot be reduced to one man's personality or political history. The immediate temptation is to frame the clash as yet another chapter in the long-running Trump versus Washington saga. But that framing misses the deeper and far more consequential issue. Lawmakers are reacting not because of who Trump is, but because of what happens to the system if his behavior becomes acceptable. This is about precedent, the kind that quietly rewrites the rules without ever holding a vote. The hook is that Washington has seen controversial presidents before, and it has survived them. What it has not survived easily are moments when institutional norms are replaced with personal exceptions. When a former president refuses to comply with congressional oversight, the danger is not limited to the present conflict. The danger is that the refusal becomes a usable blueprint. Future presidents will study this moment closely, not to learn what is legal, but to learn what they can get away with. This is why the reaction inside Congress has cut across traditional political lines. Oversight is not a partisan tool. It is a structural one. A Democratic Congress may pursue a Republican president today, but a Republican Congress will need that same authority tomorrow. Once the idea takes hold that oversight is optional for powerful figures, no party truly benefits. What remains is a weakened legislature and a strengthened executive, untethered from accountability. There is also an institutional memory at work here. Congress remembers the moments when it failed to assert itself, times when delay and caution allowed executive power to expand by default. Each of those moments seemed manageable at the time, but together they reshaped the balance of power in ways lawmakers still struggle to reverse. This refusal forces Congress to confront that history and decide whether it is willing to repeat it. Another hook lies in how precedent operates quietly. It does not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic announcements. It settles in through repetition and tolerance. The first refusal is controversial. The second is debated. The third is normalized. By the fourth, it is simply how things are done. Lawmakers understand that stopping a precedent is only possible at the beginning, when the cost is political rather than structural. What makes this especially fraught is that Trump's refusal is not grounded in a narrowly defined legal claim that can be negotiated or litigated in good faith. It is expansive, dismissive, and public. That style matters. It invites imitation. It teaches future leaders that confrontation, rather than cooperation with oversight, can be politically survivable. Congress is reacting now because it knows that once this behavior is absorbed into the political culture, it becomes much harder to challenge. The fear driving this response is not that Trump will win this particular standoff, but that the system will lose it. If precedent is set that compliance with Congress depends on personal calculation rather than constitutional duty, the damage will extend far beyond this case. Oversight will exist on paper, but not in practice. This is why lawmakers are treating the moment as bigger than Trump. Personalities come and go, precedents stay. And Congress is being forced to decide whether it will allow this one to take root. What has shifted so dramatically in this moment is not just the tone of the confrontation, but the range of options now left on the table. Once a flat refusal is issued, the space for quiet negotiation collapses almost instantly. Congress is no longer dealing with a disagreement that can be managed through back channels or procedural compromise. It is dealing with a direct institutional challenge, and that reality makes escalation not just likely, but structurally unavoidable. The hook here is that escalation is often portrayed as a choice driven by political anger or media pressure. In reality, it is the product of narrowed pathways. When voluntary compliance disappears, enforcement becomes the only remaining tool. Congress is built on the assumption that most disputes will resolve before reaching that stage. When that assumption fails, the system defaults to its hardest mechanisms. What makes this escalation feel sudden is that much of it happens out of public view. Before cameras capture fiery statements, staff attorneys begin drafting subpoenas, committees review enforcement authority, and leadership calculates legal timelines. These steps are not symbolic. They are procedural necessities. Once initiated, they create momentum that is difficult to stop without significant loss of credibility. Another hook is the political risk embedded in escalation. Contempt proceedings, court enforcement, and legal referrals are powerful, but they are also blunt instruments. Lawmakers know these moves invite accusations of partisanship and retaliation. The fact that Congress is considering them anyway signals how constrained its position has become. When the political cost of action is outweighed by the institutional cost of inaction, escalation becomes the rational path. There's also a strategic dimension that often goes unspoken. Enforcement actions do not need to succeed immediately to matter. Even prolonged legal battles send a message to future officials that refusal carries consequences. Escalation is as much about deterrence as it is about resolution. Congress understands that doing nothing would be interpreted as consent, not restraint. What intensifies this moment is that time itself becomes a weapon once escalation begins. Court challenges can stretch for months or years, but delay cuts both ways. While targets of oversight often rely on time to exhaust political will, Congress risks losing relevance if it allows delays to define the outcome. This tension pushes lawmakers toward more aggressive enforcement early, before momentum dissipates. Another compelling element is that escalation exposes the limits of congressional power in real time. Unlike the executive, Congress does not have a standing enforcement arm. It must rely on courts and the executive branch itself to carry out penalties. That vulnerability makes every escalation a test not only of resolve, but of institutional design. Lawmakers are acutely aware that failing to follow through after threatening enforcement would weaken them further than silence ever could. What makes this confrontation so engaging and so dangerous is that escalation creates a chain reaction. Each step taken by Congress narrows Trump's options, but also raises the stakes for lawmakers themselves. Walking back enforcement once initiated is politically costly and institutionally damaging. That is why the situation feels locked into motion. The refusal forced Congress onto a path where restraint now looks like retreat. Escalation, once triggered, becomes the only way to preserve authority in the face of open defiance. What ultimately elevates this confrontation beyond a routine political dispute is the realization that the basic guardrails of American democracy are being stress tested in real time. These guardrails are not dramatic institutions. They are expectations that laws will be respected, that oversight will be answered, that power will be constrained even when it is inconvenient. When those expectations are openly challenged, the system does not collapse immediately. Instead, it weakens quietly, one tolerated defiance at a time. The hook here is that democratic erosion rarely announces itself as a crisis. It often arrives disguised as fatigue, normalization, or strategic delay. A refusal today can feel manageable, even temporary. But when repeated or left unanswered, it rewires what future leaders believe is permissible. Congress understands that the danger is not chaos, but drift. A slow movement away from accountability that becomes difficult to reverse once accepted. What makes this moment especially fraught is that the guardrails depend on mutual recognition. The Constitution outlines powers, but it assumes good faith participation. Oversight only works if those being overseen acknowledge its legitimacy. When a powerful figure rejects that premise outright, the system is forced to reveal whether its safeguards are enforceable or merely symbolic. There is also a deeper anxiety driving lawmakers' response. Once a guardrail fails publicly, it is harder to rebuild than it was to defend. If Congress signals that defiance carries no meaningful consequence, future officials will not need to test the limits. They will already know them. That knowledge reshapes behavior across government, encouraging evasion rather than compliance as the default response to scrutiny. Another hook lies in how this moment reframes accountability itself. Accountability is often discussed as punishment after wrongdoing, but its more important function is preventative. It shapes decisions before they are made. If leaders believe they can ignore oversight without cost, the incentive structure of governance changes. Risk-taking increases. Transparency decreases. Power consolidates. What sharpens the stakes further is that democratic guardrails are unevenly reinforced. Some rely on courts, others on political norms, and many on institutional courage. Congress occupies a central position in that architecture. When it hesitates, the effects ripple outward, weakening not just legislative authority, but public confidence in the system's ability to correct itself. This is why the reaction is not limited to legal arguments. It is existential. Lawmakers are confronting the possibility that the phrase checks and balances could become descriptive rather than functional, something taught as history rather than practiced as reality. That fear is not abstract. It is informed by global examples where democratic institutions hollowed out without a single dramatic overthrow. What makes this confrontation so compelling is that it forces a binary outcome without ever formally presenting one. Either the guardrails hold through enforcement and consequence, or they bend under pressure and remain bent. There is no neutral result. Even delay becomes a decision with lasting implications. The refusal has turned an invisible framework into a visible test. And once a test is visible, failure carries a cost far beyond the immediate actors involved. It reshapes expectations, behavior, and belief in the durability of democratic restraint itself. This was never just about a refusal. It was about whether one man gets to decide when democracy applies to him. Congress didn't explode because Trump said no. Congress exploded because the system depends on them not accepting that answer. And now, the question isn't what Trump will do next, The question is whether Congress will prove, finally, that no one is above the law is more than just a slogan.